And welcome to the Practice as Research seminar series. I'm really excited to have you all here. Sadly, somehow, this is going to be the last one for this academic year, and it's quite surprising how quick the year goes, and suddenly we're at the end of the academic year, which is why I find it's particularly exciting to have the topic today, because it kind of gives us this opportunity to reflect on what's happened in the last academic year, but also looking ahead at plans and well, I for one, I'm using the summer to plan my next steps and stages. So having a little bit of structure for my thinking, I think is something that's quite important. And this is why I'm really excited to have today's topic, Challenges and Opportunities for Practice Researchers, the PRAG-UK report as a topic. And what's even more exciting, as far as I'm concerned, is that actually this topic was suggested by colleagues and who are in the Practice as Research network. As you all know, it's a very loosely based network, but this is something that was brought to me by the two people independently from one another, actually. And I just thought, well, let's do that then, but let's bring the two together. So we have got with us Scott and Tim. Scott McLaughlin is, sorry, I'm just checking that. Scott is an Irish composer and improviser based in Huddersfield. He's Associate Professor in Composition and Music Technology at the University of Leeds and directs the Centre for Practice Research in Arts. There's a load of other things that he's involved with. We've got his full bio on the website, so please do feel free to have a look at it. But what is important for today's session is Scott's actually been part of the steering group that's been doing these reports. So this is why it's really quite exciting to have him here today. Tim comes at this from a slightly different angle, and that's just as exciting, but it's different. So Tim is an education developer with a specialism in curriculum, and he works at the University of Arts, London, as a writer and a photographic artist, I can say it. He has 30 plus years experience of working in education with learners, artists, teachers and organisations, and his areas of interest are exactly that interplay between art and the writing practices, embodiment, the relationship between the cognitive and non-cognitive experiences, and it's exactly that aspect that Tim brings to the reading of these PRAG-UK reports. So, with no further ado, I'm just going to hand over. How we've sort of organised today's session is that the two of them are going to be giving us a little bit of a contextualisation, an introduction to themselves and their work and the reports, and then we're going to open up this space for a conversation. And obviously, you know, the three of us can happily have a conversation between us. But it would be very important or relevant if all of you would also come in and ask questions. If you don't want to come in personally, as in have yourself unmuted, etc., just put a question in the chat function. I will monitor the chat and I will raise the question on your behalf if that's what you'd prefer. We don't want anyone to feel they are excluded because they don't like a particular way of working. So please do just engage with this as much and as well as you can and to fit your way of working. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen and I'm going to hand over to Scott and Tim. Thank you very much to both of you for suggesting this and for offering your time to doing this today.
Thank you so much, Nicole, thank you for having us. It's really nice to be here. I've been following the podcast for a long time. It's really excellent stuff. I'm just going to, let's get some slides up. And hopefully, once again, I've got the correct slides in place. Nicole, is that okay?
Yes, we can see that, yes.
Lovely, thank you. Great, yes, thank you. Very happy to be here. So, actually, one thing, I was maybe didn't get this right in an email to Nicole. I wasn't actually part of the writing of the PRAG-UK reports. I was around at some of the events where they were polling and discussing these, but I wasn't personally involved in the writing of them. I came to them. I joined PRAG-UK after the fact. So myself and Tim are both here today to talk about the PRAG-UK reports, and I guess just to talk very briefly about ourselves first, as mentioned, I'm a composer. I primarily work in the area of indeterminacy. I do a lot of stuff involving feedback and making instruments do extended techniques and further than extended techniques, mostly about working out the difference between what a physical instrument can do and what a performer is trained to do and how those things intercept. But also it leads, because I run the Practice Research Center, I do a lot of work across different schools and talking to how practice research works for different disciplines, etc. Tim.
Great, thank you for that, Scott. And it's nice to meet you again and continue these conversations. So this is an image drawn from the internet. There are quite a number of Tim Stevens out there in the world. There's another one who's very interesting, whose specialism is the legal aspects of common international seas and waters. And I must contact him because I'd like to exchange emails. And this idea of sharing practice comes fundamentally to me. I started off as an educational practitioner in the community arts and basic education disability field. And I see those students effectively as my teacher trainers. And I'm completing a PhD by publication over the last 7 years. And I think that format, I've engaged with that format of what you could call the prospective thesis by publication in a practice-based inquiry PhD, I think is very interesting in this context. So I could also call myself a para-academic, if you know that reference, having that portfolio of the relationship between a professional practice as an artist practitioner, education consultant, and so on, and a part-time academic for about 17 years in various universities before my current role, which is full-time at UAL now. So I think that that's also interesting in framing the discussion in the relationship between professional practice and practice research is also interesting. Thanks, Scott.
Thanks, Tim. I wanted also, just before I go into a quick overview of what the PRAG-UK reports are. Just some people here will have read them, some people may not have come across them before. But before I get into that, I also wanted to share, and Tim, maybe you have a perspective on this too, the reason why I suggested this. Partly because we've had long conversations over 20, 30 longer years about practice research, practice as research, etc. And when the Prague reports came out and the conversations that I was seeing happening at the time, they really struck me instantly as something that could really help with the various miscommunications, misunderstandings, pockets of different ways of doing things that were happening around the country. And from my own personal experience of having done my PhD and talking to other academics, and what there really seems to be is a huge lag in the community, that everyone is working in little pockets, and it's very difficult for things to get outside those pockets and for there to be some idea of an agreement about what we're all doing that is flexible enough for us all to get on with things. And that's why listening to Nicole's podcast is fantastic, because it's one of those few things, and other people who are in this room who know who they are also doing excellent work in this area, but there's kind of not enough of this. And a lot of the time when I'm listening to conversations, sometimes from my own peers here or in other universities, often from PhD students, etc., talking about things, and I just think, oh, you haven't read the Prague reports. There's so many little conversations going on that these reports do a great job of not so much capping off, but bringing to a uniform level of understanding. And I think the Prague reports just aren't well known enough, and I think they really are foundational documents for the moment. So that's why I wanted to get into talking about them. Tim, do you have anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, just to say very quickly that I think that they struck me in the same way, actually, Scott, just as one of those rare moments of a milestone report that manages to two reports that manage to integrate a lot of debate and also help harmonize that debate. And I think if it's possible for those who are new to it, just to enumerate what it does in its title. It integrates, and it looked at the literature in arts-based research, arts research, Barrett and Bolt's creative arts inquiry, creative arts research, artistic research, performances research, action research, close to practice research, embodied research, to which we can now add Nicole's volume, Embodied Inquiry, participatory research, practice as research, of course, Nelson, practice-based research. Going back, I've discovered this through the report, actually, to the late 1800s and early 1900s, practice-based research networks in the medical profession, and practice-led research. Now, I don't know if Nicole wants to add any to that, but this term, practice research, was seemed to strike a chord of unanimity across all the interviewers and the interviewees, in settling something of the circularity, possibly, and the diversion of energies into justifying what practice research is to those that don't understand it, instead of doing practice research. And that point, to me, came across really strongly through the report.
Exactly, I completely agree. I think that's a point we'll come back to at some stage. So I wanted to start just with a quote from right in at the start of it. I've attributed this to Maria Delgado, but this was actually written by several people. But just what they say about one of the key challenges is how practice research can emerge from what many see as the ref graveyard to become a key component of an open research culture. So part of this is about a balancing act of trying to see how what we do is part of a larger research picture going on. And there's a big relationship to libraries too, and we'll come back to that in a moment. But this idea of the ref graveyard really grabbed me when I heard, it was Maria I heard talking about it, but the idea that for so long practice researchers have been beavering away at doing their practice, putting it out in the world, doing their research through practice, but that the only times we come to articulate and share it, or not the only times, but at least the most common time, is when someone says, oh, you need to put something in for ref. And then all of a sudden, all this stuff gets gathered up, beautifully articulated and explained, goes into a box, goes and disappears somewhere and is never seen again, other than from a panel of people who look at it. So a big part of this was about talking about how do we share this stuff? How do we communicate with each other? How do we get this stuff out more? And that was the hook, I think, that really grabbed me, because it was a problem I was trying to deal with too. So the brief background of this is that PRAG, which is the Practice Research Advisory Group, which is formed of partially by ref panelists, ref heads, etc., who are dealing with practice research, but also a larger field outside of that, coming together ahead of Ref 21 and trying to basically just find points of agreement. There was a whole bunch of things that were seen as problematic, and as Tim said, just getting in the way of us getting on with doing the research. And it was felt that what we needed was something to pull everyone together and try and agree some basic principles, respecting, of course, disciplinary differences, and ultimately the idea that artists are all necessarily pushing against things. So it's very difficult to pull artists into a middle at the best of times. So trying to respect these things. So there was, as I understand it, I think some funding from Research England that paid for James Bully and Ozan Shaheen to write these reports alongside editors drawn from PRAG-UK. And these reports, I think, came out just after Ref 21, but the conversations, or the couple of big days that they put on for people to come together and talk about these things, that one of those that I was at just was extremely eye-opening into what we're all trying to do and bringing people together. The two different reports that are in here, they do two different things. The first, what is practice research, is really an attempt to, after talking to, as Tim mentioned, a pile of interviewees drawn from other practice researchers, people who have assessed practice research in terms of funding or on ref panels, Also, though, librarians, metadata people, people who are trying to deal with how this stuff is shared and stored and archived, all of those conversations feed into trying to, again, get some principles that we can all largely agree on. So what is practice research? Attempts to deal with that stuff. And the second report, how can practice research be shared, is really around then the library side, the metadata, how do we get this stuff out there and deal with all those questions of ephemerality, etc., and physical objects. How, once this is made digital, do we deal with that and make it shareable and findable? And that's something we can come back to also later on to talk about how this has advanced since 2021. Very briefly, the kind of things that are in these reports. The first report deals with talking about what is practice research, what is the differences between practice and research, how do they come together, what are the ways of knowing, how do we think about this as a field, how does this work around and beyond disciplines, how do we describe it, the idea of a research narrative, which we'll come back to, different audiences, etc. It's really getting to the heart of all of these questions. Some questions I was dealing with myself all the time, some questions I really hadn't thought of until they were laid out in this way. How is it dealt with in relation to professional practice versus research, institutional support, ethics, archiving, all of these things. And what you're basically getting here is conversations between people who have been dealing with this for a long time, but laid out as a series of point by point addressings to how these things are done. The second report, like I said, is much more library and metadata focused. This is much more around how do we structure outputs, as in ref outputs. But and I will say this probably several times, one of the guiding principles of this whole thing was that this is not for ref. The point of this is that practice research should be for life. We should be sharing this stuff all the time. Ref is just an audit that comes along and peeks through our window and looks for nice things. So none of this is for ref, but it does end up benefiting ref, and in some ways it's useful to make sure that it aligns with the way that ref wants to do things. So thinking of things like item types, projects, etc., but also thinking about this as how would this go into a library? How once we've moved away from the ephemeral or the capture, and nobody likes that capture word, but for the moment it'll have to do. But how do we think about getting the insights and the information and the knowledge out of the practice itself or the process that led up to it and getting it in a way that is shareable and accessible to people? And that's another thing we'll come back to later on, this idea of fair research, findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. So that's what the reports do. They're fairly long, and I think that goes some of the way to why they're not taken up quite as much. They need to be long because these are complicated issues and they cover all the different topics along the way, which is really important. So in some ways, these may almost be more reference documents to pull things out of, but they're pretty comprehensive for dealing with that conversation. What I wanted to go on to next, I think Tim and I have not rehearsed, but talked about some of the things that we both find interesting to open this up to a conversation. So I wanted to lay out, at least for me, some of the key points that I think are worth just flagging about where the, not even where the value is, but I think what is why people really need to look at these. First off is this idea that practice research is for life. It's not just for ref. We're all doing practice all the time. The research that inheres in that is something happening all the time, maybe more now, less later, maybe in fits and starts sometimes, and very, very nonlinear and messy, as we all know. But that we have to move past the idea that this only happens for ref, and the institutional issues that come with that, that institutions only come to us when they think there's something for ref, that we need to do more about that. Also, the practice research is not just an academic thing, that it's for all disciplines and audiences, that it stretches far beyond the art, it stretches into the professional art, the public spaces. There's a huge porosity between practice researchers in academia and what they do outside academia in ways that a lot of other disciplines just don't have. But equally, there is practice research far outside the creative arts. There's practice research in medicine and health and all sorts of other places, and we can all learn from each other. And that's come up so many times in this podcast too, that breadth. It provides I say definition is the wrong word, but it provides at least a way of understanding when we say practice research, what do we mean? And to move on from, as Tim mentioned earlier, the terminological confusion. I think for a lot of us, there's a great weariness as soon as a conversation begins about, well, is it practice-led or is it practice-as? There's probably 1% of conversations where that is a useful thing, but I think a lot of the time that just ends up getting in the way. So one of the things the report tried to do was knock that on the head and just say, let's just call it practice research. And if we really need to make a distinction, we can come back to that, but mostly we probably don't. And then the last thing is a shared understanding of how we articulate and share our work to each other, both to each other, to people who we know will understand it as soon as they see it. Maybe it doesn't need any articulation. Maybe you can see my insights as soon as you hear my piece of music. But also, how do we articulate it to people who won't instantly pick it up? The idea of a research narrative, a way of articulating questions in context, which is not necessarily a piece of text. It's often done as a piece of text, but something that points people to the research elements of something, not explaining the work, not reducing the work, but just pointing to the things that the researcher thinks need to be carried forward. And a general transdisciplinary understanding of what connects us all across practice research. In what ways are a sculptor and a painter and a filmmaker all actually doing on some level the same kind of thing, the articulation, the thinking about sharing, all of that kind of thing, yet also within their own disciplines having very different ways potentially of doing things. What are the levels at which we can share methods and share ways of understanding that rises everybody? At that point, I'm going to stop because I think I want to pass over to Tim and just let Tim kickstart some reflection on this maybe, or maybe add to some of that or pick up on any of that.
Wonderful, thanks. That was a great overview. Really, really good. Thank you. And really good to hear again your key points as to what stood out. I'd like to dive into what I see as, for me, the heart of practice research and what it does. There's a quote on page 1 that says, the field of practice research is unique. So obviously just completed my PhD, that jumped out to me. The field of practice research is unique in its focus on sharing the often unrecognized ways of knowing that emerge in practice. So practice research is where practice is central to the method and the findings. But what does that mean, that ways of knowing? So I'm very interested. I came to this report through that sentence. And the ways of knowing are described as collectively, practice research collectively, as intuitive, embodied, tacit, imaginative, affective, and sensory ways of knowing. And the first thing that strikes me about that is not only that these are all facets of embodiment, but these are part of a hierarchy of the senses that over recent decades we've been trying to subvert. We've been trying to change that hierarchy in a return to the body and return to embodiment. They're all facets that are undervalued as knowledge forms, under-articulated or articulated in non-linguistic means, through objects, through making, through process, through sensation, feeling, through interaction, interpersonally and intra-psychically, if you like. And we know that values are thus central and ethics are thus central to this because we've all critiqued and we know of what the institutional critique around the power imbalances, the power differentials within those institutions that host bodies. Let's put it as generally as that. So where bodies are concerned and bodily knowledge is concerned, disregarding that, the Enlightenment hierarchy of the senses in which the visual is preeminent, and Martin Jay, and over years and years, we've been looking at those changes. We could pick any one of these types of knowledge and explore further what that means. I'd be interested in talking about all of them. I don't know if there's time to do that. Let's just pick the sensory, for instance. So it's now, what, 20 years since that term sensory studies was founded, sort of 2026, 2006, Sensory Studies Journal. And we know through Sensory Formations, the Berg publishing series, how scholarship around the sensory has grown. And it's become part and parcel of what artists use, academics use, and specialists use in terms of knowledge of perception. That's kind of post-phenomenological in some ways. And yet still, the status of sensory knowledge as knowledge can still be questioned. So we've seen similar in the field of affect and affect studies. And I think the way that these concepts fundamentally challenge what we think of as epistemological outputs, what we think of as valid knowledge, is really, really important. And then within that, whose bodies are we talking about? So those that are excluded. And some of the key points made in the executive summary of this report that I thought were really important to state at the outset is that there needs to be an equality-based review of practice research, a plan in which we can look at the representation and misrepresentation of knowledges within embodied practice research. It cites a couple of reports that I think are really important in this area. One is the Paulette Williams, Jason Arday report, The Broken Pipeline, which is barriers to Black PhD students accessing Research Council funding. There's also Hugo Dale Rivas, The White Elephant in the Room, Ideas for Reducing Racial Inequalities in Higher Education. And if we haven't already got this point, the disproportionate or the overrepresentation of what we could call weird countries, so the Western educated, industrial, rich and democratic countries, research over global and global South knowledges. On page 2 of the report, it says that support for practice research, and it's hoped that this report should support practice research not just in England, not just in the UK, but globally. And so I think it's really important when we're thinking about these knowledges, and the second aspect, which we might talk more about the searchability and the circulation of these knowledges, to connect it to things like the UN Intangible Cultural Heritage Initiative, for instance, which the UK only just signed up to last year, just last year, 2024. And under Intangible Cultural Heritage, you have craft communities, oral history, performing arts. Performing artists and specialists are central to this report in terms of the interviewee data set. And I think knowledges from those disciplines around performance have certainly helped in lots of ways. Jane Bacon and Vida Midglow's report from artistic doctorates in Europe, for instance, and how they then translated that into ideas around practice ethics from performance, but that can contribute to research generally. So there's a few key things to add, Scott. I hope that's not taken us too far away from sort of the central discursive kind of points that we're trying to make. But I hope that adds.
Yeah, absolutely. And it opens up a couple of important threads that I think we had talked about before. Something that, and I'm almost embarrassed to say this, and in fact, I'm just going to stop screen sharing for the moment. We'll bring that back up later when we come back to talk about some other things. But I'm almost embarrassed to say that when I started reading this report, it opened up to me very quickly how much I had a discipline-centric way of thinking about things. And it's only then when you start reading about people from theatre or fine art or something talking about how it works for them that you start to see the bigger picture, that this isn't, that the things that I might take for granted in my disciplinary area don't necessarily apply in other ways, that the conversations happening in other discipline areas are sometimes different. The conversation in theatre around ephemerality and how do you take something that happens in the moment and turn that into data that can then be passed on to other people. And the same conversations are happening in different places, but with different nuances. But wider than that, what you bring up around the points about ethics, etc., and the wider aspects of that, that there is a particular ethics to practice because, and at risk of oversimplifying, with a lot of other disciplines, there is researchers and there is participants, and there's a distinction between these two groups, and a lot of ethics processes are designed around this, where what the report talks about really nicely is again, the porosity of practice research as a practitioner interacting with other practitioners who may also have audiences, etc., but it's no longer as simple as the researcher and the researched or the researchees. That, for example, I might have a situation where I'm doing research in collaboration with let's say a musician, a clarinetist, who is not themselves a researcher, but who doesn't want to be anonymized as part of this, wants actually to be part of the research as a contributor, but not a researcher. So something that the report talks about really nicely is the way that practice research, and Stephen Hill of Research England talks about this in his foreword as well, that this is something that can actually bring all disciplines along, that there are things happening in practice research that can potentially change the way a lot of disciplines think about things like ethics, about archiving, about storage, and etc. So there is potential in practice research to raise the discourse for all disciplines around this. And it's also interesting to connect this with things like what didn't exist in 2021, but for example, the hidden ref, which is, and a now very well funded process of trying to acknowledge all of those parts and people involved in research who are not usually credited, the technicians, the participants, the managers, all of these other things happening as part of the research ecosystem. Hidden Ref is trying to bring to the foreground. Yet if you go back to the PRAG reports, one of the things in there is exactly talking about acknowledging the contributions of everyone who's involved. That moving away from the idea that research has an author and they are the researcher, but that actually, again, you have this ecosystem of people and there's an ethics, there's a trust that flows through that, which largely comes from not so much academic disciplines, but from the practices themselves, from what happens in those practices. And there's a real opportunity there for this. Systems is maybe the wrong word, but for the way that we talk about that and develop that to become something that other disciplines can also take on. So I think that's a really important part of these reports, opening up those ideas of collaboration, acknowledgement, positionality, situatedness, all of these things that are second nature to practice researchers, but standard research capture systems, etc., often aren't able to see.
I'd agree. And the ethics terms that Bullion Sahin conclude with as priorities are around open access and accessibility in both senses, open access in terms of searchability and interoperability, but also basic accessibility in terms of sensory impairments and those with sensory impairments, and screen readers and translation and subtitles and those sorts of additional now essential sort of accessibility guidelines, IP, intellectual property, and collaborative ethics. And I think one of the interesting things that we've done at University of the Arts over recent years, it was started by Susan Orr and Malcolm Quinn, was to open up discussions as to how we could provide ethical oversight for practice and practice in the curriculum, which didn't go through the usual research ethics route, because that's more for PhD and PhD guidelines, although there are many universities that universalize their research ethics protocols and apply it to practice or curriculum-based practices. But this work resulted in the Educational Ethics Initiative. And when I joined the Educational Ethics Committee, I co-chair the committee now, one of the things that I thought was important to do was to replace the ethics of risk with an ethics of care. And this was a really interesting move. This ethics of care is also mentioned by Michelo in her report. But I think the quote from Brig de la Bellacasa Maria on matters of care, I think is really important on that, because she says, practicing ethics in artistic research, although we know this can apply in lots of broader research disciplines, practicing ethics in artistic research might then inform how researchers act in ways which are open and sensitive to enfleshed, lived, infrastructural, environmental matters of care. For care is too important to give up to the reductions of hegemonic ethics. And I think the principles that came across quite strongly in the report that I think are really crucial are transdisciplinarity as being part and parcel of practice research, and pluralism when it comes to methodology. Now, I think this pluralism is really important because we still rely on predominantly Western ethical frameworks. And when we talk about collaborative ethics, we actually may have to admit that we might now be forced into what does it take to make institutions change, admitting non-Western ethics, because, and this raises a problem around searchability, if we redefine what it is to be an embodied person, we might be drawing on more communitarian, more collectivist ethics, de-centered, or could be called post-human, but other-centered and material-centered or planetary-centered or eco-centered ethics. And I think what these articulations start to do, if they can be integrated into the frameworks that regulate, distribute, and validate and assess this knowledge, then I think we could really start to move on from the argument about what practice research is to what practice research does. Because there may be, and this is just a guess, right? But if we look at the KEF4, so knowledge exchange framework for September, wouldn't it be interesting to think, well, what is the contribution of practice research to knowledge exchange within universities, under which of the 7 perspectives? Maybe we can see it clearly in local growth, regeneration, in working with the public, third sector, public and community, in those areas in which practice research is well embedded. But I think arguably the contributions to practice research extend across all of those 7 perspectives in knowledge exchange. So where we could be moving to a phase where the integration of the collective outputs of practice researchers might be valued in all sorts of domains apart from its traditional disciplines.
Agreed.
With you. I really, really appreciate what you've been saying there. I really do. I'm just kind of, I don't know, I'm diving in here with a question or a comment or, sort of a concern, I suppose. Because there are a few things here that have been said and that I'm kind of pining us to unpick a little bit. So the first thing is, you've both been talking about quite optimistically and positively about the contributions of practice research. And obviously all of us here, we are practice researchers, so we kind of see the contributions that we make. But how can we explain that to people who don't do practice research? And I think that's at the heart of it. Because it's all fair and square to say practice research is contributing to the knowledge exchange. And again, I'm doing exactly the same thing. So I'm almost talking against my own role here. But the question is, how can I explain that to someone who's not a practice researcher? Because I can't demonstrate that because they have seen my installation. I don't know, their attitude has changed and they're now a more empathetic person, or they're now, how can we make it tangible in that respect, so that it's actually something that helps, like formalizing practice research.
Nicole, just to say that your microphone was doing something a little funny in there, but it might be fine next time you come back on. But I think I got the gist of all that. I think that's an incredibly important question. I think what is particular, to pull it back exactly to the reports, I think what the reports really help us to do is, not to put too blunt a point on it, but if you're talking about how do we convince people outside of the value, I think what the reports do is help us convince inside. They help us have a common playing field. They help us as a field to develop a confidence about what we're doing. So moving past, as Tim just said, moving past these conversations about, well, what is it, into how do we do it, and sharing this good practice, so that we get to the point where in some cases we already are, and in some cases we aren't, where we are able to be confident about the effect that our work has and the value of our work. I don't think that we need to put it in those value concepts. I think it is much more on us to be able to talk to each other about it, and because primarily that's what research is trying to do. You want to influence other researchers to then build a groundswell of knowledge that eventually has an effect in the world. Sometimes it happens quick, sometimes not. But I think in order to convince people outside our sphere of the value of this, we need to convince each other, and we need to know. And so I think this is really an effort in creating confidence within our sector about what we do and being able to talk to each other about it. I think that's the first step.
Yeah, and I think the other thing that I think the report underlines is that the research narrative is really important.
Yes.
The research narrative alongside the practice output, whatever form that may take, they talk about extending or leaning into, or maybe I think this could be my interpretation, but looking at these other perhaps lesser used terms such as project, experiment, and not over relying on book chapters and those item descriptions, but then promoting those descriptions within the infrastructure that monitors and values these outputs. Because if projects and experiments are validated, we make the case in using all the tools available, right? We never sort of clear half the tools off the table. It's yes, it's using data, but I think the nature of the qualitative input in social impact studies and social change studies for practice research is something that needs developing and needs work on. The case studies included in the report, there are 5, I think. There's one that's extraordinary. I didn't realize it was a practice research project. I came across this film called The Art of Killing, which won the 2013 European Film Award for Best Documentary. And it's a project by Oppenheimer and Brink. And it was a research project on genocide and genre. And it was a impact case study in 2014 by the University of Westminster. It's an extraordinarily powerful piece of work. And just last week, I was invited by PRAG-UK, who's one of the board members of PRAG, to his latest film installation. It's called Impossible Conversations. And he was asking questions of us. So it's about a killing in America, a shooting in a Sikh temple, in which the white supremacist ex-gang member becomes friends with the Sikh member of the community who lost. There were 7 members of the community, including his own father, and it's the conversation between the two of them. So it's an incredibly powerful piece. And in the context of social impact, social change, I think we are being brought to a point of urgency to realize the full potential of the practice, the real world practice implications of practice research above and beyond the research project, its impact on others, how those viewing and seeing these outputs can be affected, but beyond that, how they can be useful pedagogically. And I think this is where the educational capacity needs to be looked at for how we interpret, validate, and support practice researchers and the practice research community through pedagogy. It is really important.
I'd add one thing onto that as well, that I've spoken to, not a lot, but we run at Leeds a thing where scientists and artists are brought together in small joint projects. I'm sure a lot of places do things like this, but it's always fascinating to talk to the scientists who, granted, are self-selecting, they want to be part of this, how much it's about. So bringing artist researchers in with other disciplinary researchers, the amount of times I've heard scientists talking about how much their perspective was shifted by watching an artist researcher going across the same journey and treating it as that. So it's not always our artistic outputs, our artistic final products that are necessarily where this knowledge and insights in here. A lot of the time it is in what we do rather than anything else, and is the doing of it. And that ultimately is the definition that the reports give on what practice research is. That it's a definition that doesn't want to police boundaries. It just says, if practice is the significant method in what you're doing, then it's a form of practice research. Great, carry on. And that a research narrative can be useful, going back to Nicole's point, as a way of then explaining to people for whom it's not obvious what's happening, how you can show where the research is. I'm aware that we're cutting a little bit
me
to
too.
time.
So can you hear me now? Is the microphone okay? Good. So there is a comment in the chat from somebody who's talking about exactly that, but they are saying, my main struggle has been, I've been practicing for many years, and I'm finding it challenging to bring philosophical questions, reasoning into my writing, as this seems to be the recurring requirement in traditional PhD, and just talking about my approach to my practice doesn't seem to be enough. And I think this is something that's really interesting, because it's exactly what I've been trying to say is like, well, we all value just the practice side, but in order for this to be recognized within academia, we do need to look at how they are doing it. And they are, you know, we have a research question and we need to engage with that at a theoretical level. And we have, and that's a certain kind of requirement. And I'm wondering, where is this report going to go next? Or is there something that, you know, that is going to happen to basically, you know, help us navigate those spaces? I appreciate that the first step was to make us all confident of our work, but what's next, essentially?
Just before I have a couple of slides to refer to there, which I'll bring back up in a second, but just to refer directly to Daniel's point as well, this is partly the lag that I was talking about before. It is well worth reading the sections in the Prague reports that talk about the ways of knowing, etc. That philosophy, some people use philosophy and that's useful, but there's no necessity in doing a PhD to turn from practice into being a philosopher. There's no necessity for bringing Deleuze into everything. Deleuze is useful for some things, not for everything. But the lag is partly where it happens in institutions, that there's a sense that, well, it can't be proper research if it's not doing X, Y, and Z. One of the other values of the report is this is a Research England funded and produced document. This stands as a point of authority to say, look, this is how this stuff is done, and here are the various ways it can be done. So I think the more it propagates through systems, the more it helps internally within universities, institutional staff, etc., understand the breadth of what's happening and not pigeonhole practice researchers doing one, two, or three other things. But yeah, Daniel, I definitely feel your pain. I've seen similar things happen many times. I'm just going to throw up those couple to answer Nicole's question.
Yes, please, because I'm also quite aware of the time, so I'm going to ask you, Scott, to run through your final slides.
Oh, you have no idea how fast I can be. Can you see my slides?
Yes, we can.
What
Yeah.
next? Prague reports came out in 2021. As we said, the second report is largely around the proposal of how would we do peer review and how would we share these things in a digital library context. They proposed an open library of the humanities. Directly out of that, the AHRC funded two projects simultaneously to look at this from two different perspectives. I was a co-I on the Sparkle project, and the PR Voices project ran out of Westminster. We were running at the same time 6-month projects looking at the feasibility of and the need for a repository for practice research, because generally library repositories only handle text. They're not very good at anything else. So you can go to the DOIs and the reports from those to see what we said. But basically we said, yes, we really, really need a repository because it's going to offer all sorts of new possibilities. I can announce today that, well, like I announced last week, that we have the team, the Sparkle and Pure Voices teams have been working together for the last 2 years on how to move this forward, and we have just received news that our working together will now be funded going forward. I'm not allowed to say anything else but that, but we will have an announcement to make over the next month or two about what this means, and the idea is to look even larger at the possibility of a repository and what that can do. But the really important thing out of all of this is that a repository is just a tool to get things done. There's a whole pile of work to do about helping and enabling practice researchers understand how this can be useful and how it can help us move forward. But I really think it can. I am an absolute cheerleader for this idea. Nicole, that's me.
Thank you very much. Yes.
Can I just add one sentence?
Yes, please. Of course. I was going to anyway. Yes.
Oh, thank you. So just in response, thanks for that, Scott. It's really good. I had a read of the Sparkle report today. Really enjoyed it. Just had a look through before this session. I just wanted to underline the importance of not only Western philosophers, so yes, there's process philosophers, you know, Bergson, Whitehead, and so on. There's also embodiment philosophers and feminist philosophy and feminist epistemological kind of histories, and there's so much value in these. And then we need to look at other non-Western ethics and non-Western knowledge systems, because I work with an African philosopher called Dr. Elvis Imafidon, who shared his work on Ubuntu, African philosophy, an ethic around defining the self through the other, if you like, and its value and contribution to the community, and humanness having that flexibility, and Ubuntu affording a value to things in the community, entities in the community, including animals, trees, and the environment. And I think it's only if we begin to admit really that practice research has its deepest roots actually in non-Western traditions in some ways, and perhaps its most sophisticated technologies around ways of knowing in embodied senses, that we start to really redress the epistemological imbalance that we assume in ways of in the knowledge that we see as valuable and important. Thanks. Just wanted to.
Thank you very much, both of you. I really appreciate the time that you've taken. It's really exciting to have had this conversation. Obviously, there's a lot more that we can talk about and continue this conversation. Just for the sake of completeness and in the interest of time, I'm sharing some details here on the Practices Research Network. Feel free to contact me anytime if you would like to do so. I'm quite happy to, and I'm very open to any kind of topics that you may want to bring to the network. So, please do connect with us. And yeah, it was lovely to have you both. And I hope that we're going to be able to continue that conversation in due course.